Well, good morning, everyone here at the Abbey and those at home. So yesterday, Hakuji talked about a variety of koans in the Mumonkan, including Zuigan Calls Master, which is case number 12. And so today I'd like to dive into this particular koan a little deeper and look at it from some different angles in a way that speaks to this part of Sesshin. And I think also, people have different waves in Sesshin, and sometimes people's hardest day is the last day or the second to last day. So we can use this information when we need it. So so the case goes like this, and it's called Zuigan Calls Master. Every day, Master Zuigan Shigen used to call out to himself, "Oh, Master," and would answer himself, "Yes." "Are you awake?" he would ask, and then would answer himself, "Yes, I am." Never be deceived by others any day, any time. No, I will not. And then Mumonkan's commentary on this. Old Zuigan himself sells and himself buys. He has a lot of masks of goblins and demons to play with. Why? Ni! A calling one, an answering one, an awake one, and one who will not be deceived by others. If you take these different appearances as really existing, you are altogether mistaken. If, however, you would imitate Zuigan, your understanding is that of a fox. So let me go through that koan in a different way. So that was a little bit more of a gentle, playful way. Here's another way it could sound. Every day, Master Zuigan Shigen used to call out to himself, "Master!" and would answer himself, "Yes." "Are you awake?" he would ask, and would answer himself, "Yes, I am." Never be deceived by others any day, any time. No, I will not. So you could hear that a couple different ways, and those different ways will come up later in my talk. So like Hakuju with the 3 pounds of flax, one of the reasons why I am fond of this koan and think of it often is it is simple. It's short and relatively straightforward. It's something that can intellectually be understood, unlike many, many koans, even though, like all koans, they point to something that can't be understood intellectually. But this one can be used on multiple levels. I also really like the intimacy of this koan. It's rare that we get to hear the inner workings of a Zen master. It's usually their actions that we're hearing or their words to someone else. There's often a dialogue between a master and a monk or between two masters. But in this one, there's this internal dialogue that is projecting out in an external voice for all to hear. And what I like about it is that in listening to this master talk to himself back and forth, we realize it's not just open space in there. The practice ensues. The practice continues. And finally, I appreciate this koan due to its pointing out a reality that we humans experience on an hourly basis, but don't talk about much and have very little insight into. This reality is what has spawned one of the most effective modalities in modern psychotherapy, which is called internal family systems. There's a similar modality of psychotherapy that we in the white plum lineage of Zen Buddhism use that's similar to IFS. It's called voice dialogue. So I'll talk about these a little bit more as we go and how we can use those in Sesshin, in retreat. I'll get to that a little, I'll get to the internal part stuff in a bit, but there's just two little pieces that I want to talk about the koan that are interesting that hadn't really paid attention to before until preparing for this talk. And actually, before I get into that, I just want to name that. So Zuigan was actually, what I can see from my research is that Zuigan is actually the name of the monastery that Master Shigen became the abbot and primary teacher and head priest of after his Dharma transmission and later in his years. And so, like many places in around the world, someone is known by where they're from or what place they're associated with. So Zuigan is the name in Japanese, but in Chinese, because Zuigan is actually a Chinese master from the 9th and 10th centuries, his name would sound more like Zhuiyan or something like that. I don't speak Chinese, so but something closer than Zuigan. So that's why in the koan you hear Master Zuigan, Master Shigen Zuigan. But through the talk, I'll be referring to him as Master Zuigan. So can you imagine this master and the monasteries at that day? You know, they're different sized monasteries, but this monastery might have had hundreds or thousands even of monks walking around and doing different tasks. And here's this Zen master walking through, and it says, used to call out to himself. So he's saying this out loud, loud enough for lots of people to hear. Master! Yes? Are you awake? Yes, I am. Never be deceived by others, any day, any time. No, I will not. So I don't know about you, but in my earlier years, I had a lot of self-consciousness about how I presented myself to the world. And I watched lots of movies and read books growing up, and I was always entranced by these protagonists who seemed to have no care about what other people thought about them. And I craved that kind of freedom. So you could think of pretty much Bill Murray in any movie. Iggy what's her name? Hartwood from Fried Green Tomatoes. Did I say that right? Iggy? Itzy. Pee Wee Herman even was in my generate, like I was around 10 years old or something like that when Pee Wee Herman was a thing. But talk about an eccentric, odd person, not really being too concerned about what others think. So I really like some of the stories about these Zen masters who just walked around and didn't care, and actually some of the tea ladies too. They didn't, in some of the stories, just really didn't seem to care too much about what others think of them. Another one of the two things that I noticed that I hadn't really thought about before was that teachers and leaders of any type, not just spiritual teachers and leaders, but it could be school teachers, could be political leaders, any type, sometimes will act in ways that they wouldn't normally if they were by themselves in order to model a certain behavior. So maybe a Zen teacher might purposely be clumsy and drop something around or in front of someone who tends to be a little perfectionistic. Or a Zen teacher might share something vulnerable about themselves with someone who has a difficult time sharing vulnerably about themselves. So I'm thinking about this teacher, and maybe there were some monks sitting around having some idle chatter. And the teacher was waking them up without saying anything to them directly, but modeling, are you awake? Do not be deceived by others. And then also, hopefully out of this, they would have this question, well, who's the one who's the I who's saying yes? And who's the I who's saying, no, I won't? So moving on to the point that I really like to get to with this koan. In the book No Bad Parts, which Jameson shared with me recently, written by Richard Schwartz, who's the founder of Internal Family Systems, which I'll just call IFS for short. He said this, and I have a few quotes from him that are kind of long. We were all raised in what I'll call the mono-mind belief system, the idea that you have one mind, out of which different thoughts and emotions and impulses and urges emanate. That's the paradigm I believed in too, until I kept encountering clients who taught me otherwise. Because the mono-mind view is so ubiquitous and assumed in our culture, we never really question the truth of it. He continues, all of us are born with many sub-minds that are constantly interacting inside of us. This is in general what we call thinking, because the parts are talking to each other and to you, constantly about things you have to do or debating the best course of action, and so on. Remembering a time when you faced a dilemma, it's likely you heard one part saying, "Go for it," and then another part saying, "Don't you dare." Because we consider that to be a matter of having conflicted thoughts, we don't pay attention to the inner players behind the debate. So here the author is talking about a universal human experience of these internal parts talking to each other, which when I use the word parts, we could be talking about energies, motivations, desires, voices. There's a lot of different words that we use for these things. Energies is a nice word because they speak to something that's happening beneath the words, something that's driving the words. And so sometimes we can have conflicting energies that don't actually have words to them. And what's interesting, and one of the things he said they talk to you. So a little piece of the quote that he said was that he said, the internal parts are talking to each other and to you. So are those parts not you? And what is the you that he's talking about? So when Zuigan was saying, are you awake? Who's the you that he's talking to? And who's asking? And when he says, when he talks about deceiving, who is it that's doing the deceiving? And who is it that's being deceived? Isn't this why we're here? Many of us, to find this answer. Who am I? What is this? What is mu? What is the sound of one hand? What is my original face? So Schwartz continues, while it may sound creepy or crazy at first to think of yourself as a multiple personality, I hope to convince you that it's actually quite empowering. It's only disturbing because multiplicity has been pathologized in our culture. A person with separate, autonomous personalities is viewed as sick or damaged, and the existence of their alter selves is considered simply the product of trauma, the fragmentation of their previously unitary mind. From the mono-mind point of view, our natural condition is a unitary mind. The mono-mind paradigm has caused us to fear our parts and view them as pathological. In our attempts to control what we consider to be disturbing thoughts and emotions, we just end up fighting, ignoring, disciplining, hiding, and feeling ashamed of those impulses that keep us from doing what we want to do in our lives. And then we shame ourselves for not being able to control them. In other words, we hate what gets in our way. So coming back to the day 2 and day 3 experience, Day one, we can have sort of a shutdown of all the bad parts, all the parts that seem to cause us trouble, and we can bliss out and have some peace and sink in a little bit. Again, not everybody's experience, but sometimes this is a common thing I hear people say. And then on day two and day three, when that balloon starts squeezing and the air starts coming out, the energy that's stored in the body moves through the brain and manifests as thought, manifests as language. When we don't feel our bodies directly, it's like the metaphor I've used before. It's like methane buildup from carbon matter in a landfill finding its way out through the ventilation pipes. So that energy is moving out of our composting system. And if we're not paying attention to it, if we buried it, it comes out as thought or as anxiety or depression. In the Great Heart retreats that our Roshis, Shinko, and Shishin used to lead, they used voice dialogue to help participants get in touch with disowned and traumatized parts, as well as the parts that had the power to heal and embrace those traumatized and wounded parts. And this would help those voices or parts or energies become more accepted and integrated in the overall system of the experience of self, and not just pushed back into the closets or into the unconscious, or what the Buddha called the storehouse consciousness. When we bring the vampires out into the light, it gives them a chance to be heard, understood, and transformed into healthy, living beings. So many teachers in the White Plum lineage around the world use voice dialogue tools to work with their students, to work with these emotional baggage, with this emotional baggage, this emotional karma. So there's different types of parts, and generally speaking, through IFS and voice dialogue, there are what are called vulnerable parts, and then there are protected parts. And the vulnerable parts are like the inner children. So it's like the children inside of us that were, well, there's happy, pleasant ones, and then there's wounded ones that carry all our pain. And the pleasant ones are like our curiosity, the curious child, the one that loves to see light coming through a prism and moving around the room. The playful child, the loving child, the compassionate child, or you could say childlike energies or childlike parts of ourselves. And then there's the wounded, vulnerable parts, the parts that carry our guilt, our disappointments, our resentments, our shame, our pain. And because we have those wounded parts, we have equally strong, well, depending on how deep the wound is or how big the wound is, we have equally powerful protectors. So we need protectors. We need both parts. We need protectors and we need vulnerable parts. And in a healthy system, in a system that's functioning harmoniously, the protectors are simply helping us get through the day, get to places on time, make sure we don't say things that are offensive to others, make sure that we get enough sleep. So those parts show up and they talk to us. They say, hey, I know you're really enjoying this TV show right now, but it's bedtime. Or, hey, I know this food is really good right now, but we really don't need another bite of this. And so we have these protectors inside. But then there's the children that say, no, I want more. And then the battle ensues. Now, making that relative to our practice outside of Sesshin, oh, I should sit more. But I'm tired, I'm going to go to sleep. Those might both be protectors right there. Well, the tired part is the vulnerable part, but then the part that actually decides could be a protector. Or the part that says, no, you need sleep. That would be a protector. And so we have both, just like with the children, we have both healthy functioning protectors and then we have toxic protectors. And the toxic protectors can be inner critics, outer critics, perfectionists, those parts of ourselves that function out of fear. Many people struggle with a really intense inner critic. This voice that just shows up during Sesshin. You'll never amount to anything. You'll never be enlightened. Da 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 da. You suck. Or an outer critic. That person never does it right. They don't know how to bow correctly. They don't do this. I can't believe the soup was cold. Blah, blah, blah. All these kinds of things. So which type of part was speaking when Zuigan says to himself, never be deceived by others, any day, any time? Is this a vulnerable part or a protective part? So again, the vulnerable parts include both our happy and emotional wounded parts, and the protective parts protect the vulnerable parts as well as protect the body and the overall health and success of the person. Throughout the day, we have parts that show up and are trying to maximize our happiness, minimize our discomfort. So the basic pleasure principle. In Mumonkan's commentary on Zuigan Calls Master, he says, Zuigan has a lot of masks, goblins and demons to play with, a calling one, an answering one, an awake one, and one who will not be deceived by others. So which energy is the one that is calling out to Zuigan and calling, is he awake? And then which one is answering, yes, I am. So at the entrance to the Zen monasteries in South Korea, where I lived for a little while, about 20 years ago, there was these gates that you would walk through to get into the monastery. And there was a wall around the monastery. And the gate was like an arch. And then it was like a tunnel, a tall tunnel. And when you walked in, you really noticed these big statues that were looming. They were actually leaning forward and looming. And they had these wrathful faces with big eyeballs and no eyelids. Kind of like some of the images that you see actually right around the room from the Tibetan and Nepalese and Bhutanese images of Vajrayana Buddhism. So these wrathful type creatures or deities or bodhisattvas, spirits, there. And they're the protectors. They're the protectors of the monastery. Now there's other protectors all around the monastery, but that was one set of protectors. So I ask you, what do you think they were protecting the monastery from? Why were they there? So we have to be on our toes, don't we? At any moment, our biological tendencies can take us toward immediate sources of pleasure and familiar habitual patterns. Sometimes we can enjoy our pain. It can be a source of power, anger, for example, but other pain too, sometimes depression. There can be an enjoyable piece to this, and the Roshis talk about it in their book, The Great Heart Way, where you can learn to enjoy your twisted karma. And so, what do they take us away from? They take us away from awakeness, from mindfulness. We can become seduced into the patterned defensive energies in our bodies and minds. All the while, there's a part somewhere inside saying, Mui, what are you doing? Let's be present. Let's drop those thoughts and concentrate on the here and now. Or, Mui, what are you doing? Stop. Stop that. Let's be happy. Let's find the real way to happiness, not this stuff. Please. So a Zen monastery is no place for the faint of heart, the weak of character. There are other places that are better suited for these people to find healing and make headway into their individual paths of evolution. The leaders of traditional Zen monasteries save themselves and the inquiries and the inquirers much heartache if they can weed out the ones who are not a good fit. 3 a.m. starts, no days off for a week at a time, simple foods, lots of meditation, lots of manual labor. In Japan, even to this day, young priests must sit in a single position without moving, and nuns, in front of the monastery for an entire day or more before they are allowed into the monastery. And I haven't been to every monastery out there, and I've only been to a few, really, or maybe 10, or maybe a little more. But people do things different ways, and I've heard stories of having to sit 3 days in one position without moving before being allowed into the monastery. So these are external protections that serve a purpose similar to the purpose Master Zuigan's calls out to himself serve. In the prayer for peace, our opening chant during our standard service, this is what we say. All Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, protectors of the Dharma and the three treasures, with all sentient beings, we lift our hearts to transform ignorance, violence, and suffering. May healing and peace prevail throughout the Dharma worlds. Maha Prajna Paramita. So Zuigan Calls Master is right there. We have to protect the Dharma in order to transform ignorance, violence, and suffering. We are here in Sesshin to protect the Dharma. And what is the Dharma? The Dharma is you. Your protectors brought you here, as well as your vulnerable parts. There's a part that just longs to be awake, that longs to be free, that longs to relieve and end suffering for you and for others. And it's that longing that put me on the path a long time ago and kept me. And even when I strayed, it brought me back because there was something unfinished inside, something that was still longing to find an answer, to find peace. And so our protectors are the ones that get online and sign up for Sesshin. Our protectors are the ones that say, we're going. They carve it out in the schedule. The protectors pack a suitcase full of clothes. The protectors put gas in the tank, change the oil, buy a plane ticket, get your work all lined up so you can focus as much as you can here. It's also the protectors that say, is this a safe place for me to practice? Do I trust these teachers? Do I trust the Sangha? Is Zen the right thing for me? So the vulnerable children are asking those questions, and then the protectors do their research. How vulnerable can I be with the teacher? Can I go into Dokusan and give it my all? Can I trust that Roshi Sensei and Roshi will respect me, will not judge me if I act like a fool in front of them as I present my koan? So in voice dialogue, like I've said, there are the vulnerable parts and the protective parts. But there's something or some things greater than these parts. The aware ego is like the manager. So in voice dialogue, they call it the aware ego. It's like the manager, the CEO of the self structure. This is typically what is the familiar sense of self, the I, the me, that we often identify when we say, this is my hand, this is my life. Those are my internal parts. That my that we're talking about is this aware ego. Ego in a good sense. This is a positive form of the ego. We need the ego to function in the world. It's not a thing, it's a set of neural pathways. It's part of our biological, physiological brain structure. But we need this to function in the world. It's the part, or it is the aspect of us that, if working appropriately and accurately, is managing all the parts that are in conflict with each other, or the parts in general. So in recovery world, I worked in residential addiction treatment, and often I heard the phrase, the internal committee. So if you imagine a leader of the committee and then the committee, every committee member has an opinion. No, I think we should do this. No, we should do this. No, I don't like your idea. My idea is better. And then ideally there's somebody you can say, okay, can you tell me more about your idea? I didn't really understand what you were saying. Can you tell me more about that? And eventually there's an executive decision that's made. Ideally, you get all the parts working together. Okay, is everybody on board with this? We all working together here? We're going to Sesshin? Anybody, any nays? But eventually there's one part there that makes, or this bigger self that makes a decision. In our brain, it's called the executive functions. These are the executive functions. You could say a lot of the parts are executive functions, but there's even an executive function. In the Matrix, there was an architect that was kind of in charge of a lot, but there was still something even bigger than the architect. When we aren't in touch with that aware ego, then it can be the parts that are running the show. Some people live primarily out of a part. I'm sure many of you know this part a little bit about yourself, but probably know somebody in your life who's really completely or almost completely in this, the perfectionist. Or someone else who's kind of like the surfer. Yeah, man, just hanging out, nowhere to go, it's all good. That's a part. That's not the aware ego speaking. And so some people can fully become a part, a primary self, it's called, until they get in touch with what is driving that need to be there. And it's usually developed in response to whatever the parental family situation was growing up. So they had to become a part to be able to survive in that particular environment. So there's even something bigger than the aware ego. And out here in the ox herding pictures, you'll see there's an ox herder. But then later down the line, the ox herder disappears. And true emptiness is experienced. But then in the 10th ox herding picture, the person is back. There's a self, there's something there that's back, but now it's functioning very differently. So much of Zen practice is actually getting in touch with this aware ego and learning how to feel the body and allow the energies to arise with awareness, with non-judgmental awareness, so that that healing and twisting the healing can happen and the twisting can untwist. And the karma resolves itself with simply just awareness and kindness and compassion and loving kindness and space, just giving yourself space to feel. So within the compassion of the great ocean, the waves come into being and then out of being over and over again without a trace. Occasionally the surface of the ocean comes to a halt and all is at peace. The moon reflects so perfectly that one cannot tell if they are looking at the ocean or the moon. And then it stirs again, but only at the surface. Underneath, there are currents of energy flowing in various directions, and deep within, there is just the silent, settled darkness, unagitated and free. So practicing. You might have a primary practice that is following the breath, listening to sounds, putting the awareness down into the hara, feeling the whole body breathe, some kind of concentration practice. And then you might have a koan on top of that, or maybe the koan, if it's mu or one or something like that, or then that might be the concentration practice itself. Or maybe your practice is open awareness. If we're too stuck on a practice, we might miss something really important that's coming up in the practice. And so if we find ourselves on the cushion fighting, like trying to come back to the breath over and over again, but it's just not, that's probably not helpful. There's some kind of energy that's showing up as thought. And so get curious about the energy that's happening in the body. This isn't a cognitive process. This is still an awareness practice. So it's bringing the attention, the awareness into the body and seeing what's happening, seeing what the emotional, feeling, sensational experience of the body is. And then absorbing into it, diving into it, becoming one with it, not holding back. And finally, I want to say that it's okay to emote. It's okay to have tears. It's okay to shake. If you really start sobbing in the zendo, it's okay to get up and go somewhere, find a place that's private. If you're coming from off-site, if everybody's in the zendo, there's lots of rooms available. Just go in a room and find a place to lay down or ball up and curl up into a ball and let that energy move through the body in the way that it needs to. But this isn't acting out. Emoting isn't acting out. It's letting the energy come through the body in a way that it needs to. And this is the same as the koan about reaching back for a pillow in the middle of the night. It's us letting go and letting this wisdom, this prajna that's deep within, be in control and let go, like Hakuju was saying yesterday. Let go of trying to control it and just let it happen in a way that's not hurtful to others, ideally. But sometimes it happens. So I want to finish with a couple last things here. With that practice, we have to find a balance between discipline or shila, which is also precepts, and relaxation, or shamatha, or samadhi, or gentleness, or metta, loving kindness. And not too tight, not too loose. So when the mind finds its clarity, boy, tighten up, get in there. Take advantage of those moments or those hours when the mind is clear. Really concentrate. And when everything starts stirring around inside, loosen up a little bit. Give it some space. Let that horse go into a bigger pasture for a little while. And so I'll finish actually with a Christian psalm. It's the one that's on the altar in honor. In honor of Shinzen's mother who passed. If you listen to the psalm, it's Psalm 23. You've all heard it before. A lot of what I'm talking about today is in this psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So who is the Lord? Who is the Master? He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Who's the he? Where in you is that? Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. What is your rod? What is your staff? The staff can be compassionate. The staff can be disciplining. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So again, who is the Lord? Where is the Master?